right, welcome to another episode of The Producing Half. I'm your host, Thomas. I didn't really prepare for today's episode. Normally I do a lot of preparing on how I want to present it and doing some research a little bit and outlining everything. But this one kind of snuck up on me, and I just didn't do a lot of preparing, but I don't really need to because I'm not going to focus on what everybody else focuses on. This one is going to be about the Second Amendment, gun rights, the right to bear and keep arms. It's pretty contentious right now because of all the mass shootings. We focus on the tool instead of the cause because we're not the brightest people or the brightest creatures in the universe, I guess. You don't blame the car for a drunk driver, but you blame a gun for a shooting. That makes little sense. The gun didn't get up and go shoot somebody. The whole thing about the Second Amendment to me is about fear. There's a certain class of people that are afraid, and so in turn they attack. That's all they know how to do. They know how to attack. Plus, they're easily controlled. And so people with nefarious, that want to do something, but the guns are staying in their way. Their intentions are not so pure. They have an agenda that a well-armed populace would prevent from taking place. They are, those people are easily controlled by the other individuals that have an agenda. So that's the Second Amendment, the right to keep and bear arms. You would think that would be such an easy thing. I mean, it's the right to keep and bear arms. But before we get into the Second Amendment, let's talk something I might have mentioned before, which to me is natural rights. One of the natural rights that there are, and when I say natural rights, it means the Constitution is great, love it. State constitutions, better, love them. The amendments, love them as well. The issue with the Constitution is that it's written by men. And so those men who wrote it had an agenda, and they wrote it in such a way to further their agenda. But there are natural rights out there, natural rights that are independent of what a man can write down or type up. These natural rights have always been there. They were always there. They were always our rights. We didn't have to, they weren't created or invented. They were just there. They're just part of being in this universe. And one of those is property rights, in my opinion, is the right to own something that's entirely yours. You have that right. It's yours to do with. It's your property, and people can't, back to the fundamental or natural laws, do all that you say you'll do, and do not infringe on other people or their property. That's a natural right. Another natural right is the right to protect yourself. That's a super important. The right to life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. Those are just natural. I mean, I know some of them are articulated in the Constitution, but those are natural rights that we all always had. Now, they were always oppressed. They were always, infringed upon by the monarchs or the pharaohs or the dictators. But they always existed. They were always there. The right to free speech, I believe that's a natural right. To be able to talk freely is a natural right, in private property. And the most fundamental is the right to life. And one of the easiest way for people to protect their lives is a firearm. It's a great equalizer. I'm 6'4" and rather, robust. I've been, a physical laborer most of my life until the last 15 years or so, 20 years. But, so I was able to protect myself with or without a gun, all things being equal. In other words, that person didn't know how to fight either, because I don't know how to fight. But just by pure size and strength, I was able to protect myself. As long as the other person didn't know how to fight, didn't have a knife, and did not have a gun. But you take a 80-pound, 70-year-old grandma, and you hand her a 38, and all of a sudden she can protect herself against me. She can protect herself against anybody. So it's a great equalizer for your ability to pursue your right to life. It is definitely a right. Now, the Second Amendment. So we understand that the right to own a firearm, no matter what kind of firearm it is, and really it doesn't matter what kind, maybe short of nukes, is a natural right. We've all had it, and we always had it, no matter what the left Marxists want to do. I have a handy book here. It actually just came in today, so I haven't had a chance to read it yet. I can't even tell you how long ago I ordered this book. I got it from Hillsdale College. I think you had to donate $100 to get them to send you this book. It was back when I was really studying the Constitution. I've read a lot about the Constitution then, but I'm still going to read this as well. And I actually, instead of listening to it, I'll actually have to read this book. But luckily, it has the Second Amendment in here, so I don't have to Google it or write it down. I can just read it. So the Second Amendment, by the way, I guess before we do this, because the Constitution is important, and the Founding Fathers' views were important, but we all need to focus more on what the ratifiers' intentions are. So a lot of these amendments had something to do with the ratifiers. The states who were going to ratify the Constitution, they wanted to make sure, and they're the people. But we'll get into it more as we go along, I'm sure, if I remember. A well-regulated militia, and that was everybody who was able-bodied, and we're talking teenagers. I guess women weren't considered part of the militia, but if you were 12 years old, you were supposed to have a gun and be able to use it. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. Now here's something that the free state, they did not mean the federal government. You see, back in these days, states were independent nations. And the United States was never supposed to be what it is today. It was supposed to be independent nations united for mutual defense and, mutual growth. But it was never supposed to be this huge federal government that rules everything and gets to tell the states what to do. No. So one of the parts of the amendment, being necessary to the security of a free state, they meant protect themselves from the federal government. They meant that, They foresaw what would happen if we ever allowed the federal government to get too big and too powerful. They understood that. And they understood that the Supreme Court was really not a check on the other two branches of the government. They understood that. They understood what was going to happen, and they did everything they could to prevent that from happening. Being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people. They specifically said people. They mentioned the state, and then they said people. To keep and bear arms. Not only to own a gun, but be able to have it with you, to walk around with it, to bear it. And this next sentence seems to be so hard for people to understand. Shall not be infringed. Shall not be infringed. Infringed is an easy word. It means you can't do anything. You can't do anything to the people's right to keep and bear arms, and you can't do anything to the state's right to have militias. This was all about protecting the states and the people from the federal government, along with having an armed populace that could be formed into an army quickly and not needing to mass produce weapons at a drop of a hat, because America was never supposed to have a standing army, and we still shouldn't. We should have a very small defensive force. We should not be the world's police going around. It's always the poor people's sons and daughters and moms and dads that die overseas, not the rich elite, not the politicians and their rich benefactors. So this, I don't understand how we have any discussions on the Second Amendment when you just read this. It is blatantly obvious what the Second Amendment says. It is obvious for all, and if you understand what the ratifiers of the Constitution, what they meant by it, which anybody who has Google could look up at the state conventions, what the Federalists and what the people who were trying to form the federal government were telling the ratifiers. They were telling the ratifiers that all these things were meant to protect the states and the state rights, and that the federal government would never be this huge monstrosity that just became a dictator. Of course, they knew it would eventually, and that's why we had the bill. They would not. The Bill of Rights was forced upon the Constitution before the states would ratify it, because the people who were trying to push for the United States and push for the Constitution, the federal government, they said to the states that we don't need this Bill of Rights because these rights are already like the Constitution grants rights to the federal government. It doesn't take away rights from the people. So if it's not listed in the Constitution that the state has the right to take away your guns, then why would we need an amendment for it? Because the Constitution only gives certain freedoms or rights to the federal and state governments, and everything else is reserved. If you read the Constitution, it says that, grants the federal government these rights. And then it grants the states, and then whatever rights that it doesn't grant are reserved to the states and are reserved to the people. So that was the argument for the people who were, like, let's just do the Constitution, we don't need a Bill of Rights. It's because they didn't need it, because it was implied that those rights were always there for the people. But there were lots of states and ratifiers of the Constitution. No, we need these things implicitly stated in the Constitution. So there you got the Bill of Rights. So for everybody who has 3 brain cells and can listen with ears, or if it's Braille with their fingers, or read with their eyes, can read that sentence and know that the federal government has zero ability to prevent people from owning weapons of any kind, any arms. They have 0%. You got to use a little common sense there, but not really. States, I would argue that states don't have the right either, because the privileges, it's it's a natural right, and even a state could not infringe upon it. And so the rights that were not reserved to the federal government were then reserved to the state, and then if they weren't reserved to the state, then they're reserved to the people. Well, that was a right that was specifically said that the right for the people should not be infringed. So it was always supposed to. It was so they didn't understand how ignorant we the people would become, how complicit our representatives would become, and how duplicit our representatives would be. I didn't really go through a lot of the stats, and this won't be a super long podcast, because to me, we're done talking about it, right? It's a natural right. It's always existed. If it was sticks, if it was swords, or if it was guns, it always existed. It doesn't matter. We have the right to defend ourselves. And who should you defend yourself from? Well, yeah, there's crazy people out there, and there's criminals out there. But who's killed more people than anybody? Who has killed more human beings than anybody? Let me help you with that answer. It's governments. They have killed more people, murdered more people, blatantly murdered more people than anybody else. But there is some, so I always like to, people will quote, this minigun, this. They'll try to quote stats. Well, there's a saying that stats don't lie, but liars use stats. Because it's just, you can manipulate the numbers however you want, depending on how you populate the data, or how you're formulating everything, and what's your error. It's just, I had a trigonometry teacher who would go through a lot of polls and things you'd see in the news or something, and he'd break out the math of them and show how he could make them say, using their criteria, he could make them say whatever he wanted them to say, and they would still be mathematically sound. And so stats are hard to use as a defense and as an argument for gun rights, or taking away gun rights. there are anywhere between, but there are some stats that are just, and again, I don't want to get into a bunch of stats because then you're just arguing semantics. And why do we need to argue stats? Because the right to keep and bear arms is a natural right that no one has the ability to infringe upon. We thought it was so important. We put it in the Constitution, and many states have it in theirs as well. That's how important the ratifiers. And I can't state enough how important it is for the ratifiers, how the ratifiers saw everything. The people who are really, not the few elites who did the Constitution and were pushing it on everybody, but how the people who were agreeing to be bound by it thought of it. And that is more important than what the Founding Fathers thought, which I'm a fan of the Founding Fathers, so I'm not talking against them. But it's more important how the people who were agreeing to form this association and what they thought about it all. But there are some interesting stats out there, and we're going to stay very broad and not very detailed. And so there are anywhere between 800,000 to 3 million defensive gun uses every year in the United States. And those are from, I think those stats come straight from Obama. After Sandy Hook, matter of fact, I did copy and paste that somewhere. So the Centers of Disease Control, in a report ordered by Obama after Sandy Hook, estimated that the number of crimes prevented by guns could be even higher than what people thought. As many as 3 million crimes were prevented by guns every day. How many deaths do you think that prevents? How many? And so if I'm going to get an argument about stats with somebody, I always make them lose their own argument. I don't go into all the stats they got from whatever left-leaning, website or news organization. I just stick to some easily, like something that's just raw stats, the FBI stats. And I only ever say this, and it's so let's say guns. Let's just forget all about the stats. Let's just talk me and you. Let's say that guns kill 1,000 people. 1,000 people are murdered, illegally killed by firearms every year. I know it's more. Let's just say it's more. Let's say it's billions. I don't care. But let's just, for easy's sake, let's say it's 1,000. 1,000 people are murdered in mass shootings, whatever the case may be. It's not that much, but let's say, as far as mass shootings go, let's say it's 1,000 people. And they're like, okay, well, let's agree to 1,000 people. How many more lives would need to be saved by guns for you to be okay with guns being around? How many more? Let's say there's 1,000 people murdered by illegal use of firearms. People who shouldn't even own the gun. Mass shooters, crazy people, nutcases, Trump supporters. Let's say that 1,000 people would 1,100 people saved. So you got 1,000 people died because there's guns, but there's another 1,100 people saved. So that means that without legal ownership of guns, there might be 2,100. And then of course they'll argue, well, if there's no guns, how would these people have killed people? They would have killed people. If you're going to kill somebody, you're going to kill them. Just look at London and all the knife deaths. And there's other ways. Cars, you don't see them banning U-Hauls because a guy runs through and mass kills people with a U-Haul. And he didn't have a gun. He just used a U-Haul. Killed more people than most mass shootings. So there's lots of ways to kill people. But let's just say 1,000 people are murdered with guns every year, but 1,100 are saved. Is that worth it to you? And they'll say, well, no, because if you didn't have guns, maybe only 100 of those people will die. Okay. Well, if 1,000 people and 2,000, no. How about 1,000 people and then 5,000 people are saved by legal ownership of guns? And they start wavering. I'm like, you know what? Let's just say it's 10,000. 10,000 people. 1,000 people are murdered by guns, but 10,000 people are saved by guns. And at that point, generally speaking, they're like, yeah, if that was true, then I'd be okay with it. Well, so that's 10 times. So you need 10 times the number of lives saved by something than killed by something, murdered by something. And they're like, yeah, at that stat, then I'd be willing to move forward. Okay. Well, the real stat, depending on how you want to use it, is between 50 to 80 times. 50 to 80 times more. There are 50 to 80 times more lives saved by firearms than by murders, by illegal uses of firearms. 50 to 80 times, depending on how you want to work the stat. That's why it's such a huge broad. If you're super pro gun and you're just, cherry picking your stats, you're going to be in the 80, you're going to be the 80 times range. If you're super liberal, you're probably going to be below 50, but you're going to be close to 50 times as many people's lives are saved, crimes are stopped by defensive use of firearms. And it's so hard to even know. And that's why they say that 2.5 million crimes are prevented, or even more, basically 7,000 a day, because brandishing prevents so many crimes. Just the they've interviewed felons. 60% of convicted felons avoided committing crimes if they thought their victim could be armed. 40% of them said that they would avoid committing crimes when they thought that the area, that there's lots of guns in the area. 60% said if they thought that the person knew, if they really thought they might have a gun, 60% of them said they wouldn't do it. 40% said that if they just suspected in the area that it was a high gun area, like, oh, this neighborhood, these guys own guns, they didn't go there. Had nothing to do whether they thought they'd get away with it, but it's just they were afraid of getting killed. Felons also, when they interviewed them, said that they didn't go into houses that they thought the people owned guns. Fewer than 1%, and this is a FBI stat, I believe, fewer than 1% of the firearms in America are used to commit a crime. Not murder. I'm not even saying murder. I'm just saying a crime. Fewer than 1%. I wonder what the percentage of cars are used in a crime, but we're not trying to ban cars. You have to understand the agenda behind everything. When you de-arm a populace, just look through history whenever we de-armed populaces. Look in what happened. Look what happened in Russia. Look what happened in Cambodia or in Germany. Look anywhere where they de-arm the populace, what happens to the populace. And these leftists who want to de-arm the people seem to be under the impression that they're going to be protected, and they'll be some of the first to go, because they're already willing to revolt and be kind of radical to begin with, and then when they finally get what they think they want, it's not going to be what they want. So they're going to be some of the first. They're going to be some of the first to go. Guns are meant to keep. First of all, the whole argument with the police are there to protect you. Well, that's a joke. I have never had the police show up in time to stop anything from happening. I've never seen it. I remember once we had some people try to break into our house when I was a kid. And I was, a teenager. By the time the police got there, we'd already handled the situation, and it was like 15 minutes later. I mean, there was nothing that we would all be dead. I remember, I don't remember this at all. Although I wonder if that's where I got those nightmares I used to have as a kid. I always used to imagine there was something standing over me, watching me while I slept when I was a wee little lad. Could have been that I watched American Werewolf in London when I was like 5 years old. My parents were weird. They let me watch anything. But so a guy broke into our house when I was about 4 or 5 years old, and my dad found him standing over my crib. And he had a shotgun, and he didn't shoot him, mainly because there was no ammo in the shotgun. Luckily, the guy didn't know that, because the guy was armed. He had a gun. He had a .357. And he ended up, it took forever for the police there. Matter of fact, my mom screaming bloody murder, the neighbor came over with his gun and helped, who was, at this point, that gun was loaded, so my dad went and loaded his shotgun after that point. And the neighbor came over, and that guy had killed kids. He was a kid. He is a kid killer. He kidnapped and killed kids. So this happened when I was 4 or 5 years old, and he was standing over my crib. What was he going to do? Nothing good. He broke into our house. So in that case, I can tell you personally, a firearm saved my life because he had a gun. It's just that my dad had to drop on him. And if the guy would have realized that my dad's gun was unloaded, which an unloaded gun is worthless. And you know, I grew up in my house with guns 24/7. Like, there were guns everywhere. I never even thought about it. You didn't touch them unless you needed them. You definitely didn't play with them. They were all loaded. There was always a shotgun next to the front door. There was none of the guns were hidden or locked away. And my brother was not a good person, and he never even messed with them. He was 4 years older than me, and he was a bit of a wild one for sure. And you know, I remember I was probably in third or fourth grade, going out with my 12 gauge automatic hunting by myself. You know, shooting rabbit or dove or quail. We lived out in the middle of nowhere, so there was no, like, I wasn't going to shoot anybody. We were on acreage out in the middle of nowhere. But it never even crossed my mind. I've had a gun my entire life. Nowadays I keep my firearms all locked up so that my children can't get to them. Mainly just because the culture we live in today. I don't think my boys would ever be so stupid. They would know that what would happen to them if I ever caught them playing with one of my guns. But I just keep them locked up. And my oldest son, he's 15. He has a Henry 22, a lever action. I've taken him to the gun range and let him. They're not really into guns. My youngest, I've taken him to the gun range and shoot a pistol. He doesn't really like it. It's too loud. I don't like loud noises either, so I don't blame him. But we just grew up with guns. I always grew up with guns. It was never a big deal. But the problem isn't the guns. These mass shootings, the problem is not the guns, it's the people. It's a different world we live in, and there's all this SSRIs, and you notice a lot of these mass shooters are on these mood stabilizers, and they kill people not when they're discontinuing them, but when they change the dosage. Then they go nuts and start shooting people. That's when they go crazy, these SSRIs. And I saw one interview with this psychologist I guess she was writing a book. And this was a while ago, so I don't know if it's still true for all the shootings since. But 100% of the mass shooters were on the serotonin uptake inhibitors, or whatever those drugs are called. Again, I watched this interview a long time ago, and I have not put any research into it. But I remember that. She said 100% of the mass shootings in her book the guys were on these SSRIs, I think they call them, serotonin uptake inhibitor or something, I don't know. But, and I want to say, you can't quote me on this one, definitely Google it if you want to use it, that 100% of them had recently had their dosage changed in some way before they committed the mass shooting. Now, if you want to go crazy, if you want to go tinfoil hat and go down the conspiracy rabbit hole, you can say that if you want there to be mass shootings, all you have to do is put out a directive, change something with, have a bunch of people on these drugs, and then just change something with the dosage. You need to change the dosage with your patients who are experiencing this. You just put that blanketly out with all the psychiatrists and the psychologists out there, and you're going to get, just as a pure numbers game, you're going to get mass shootings. I'm just saying, if you were a conspiracy theorist. I don't give, and one of my flaws is that I don't give our federal government much credit. And I've said it before, that if one of the greatest things the devil did was convince the world he didn't exist, and one of the greatest things our government, or any government, has done is convince the world, or its people, that they're stupid. And so that's a flaw that I have as well, is because I never give my government credit for being able to pull off any of these conspiracies that these wackos, I should stop saying wackos because some of them are true. Look at Epstein. But that these people say, that I'm just like, there's no way. I just don't see these guys that pay $8,000 for a toilet able to pull this off. And and everybody keeping their mouth shut. How does everybody keep their mouth shut? That's the thing, is in today's world. Look at what O'Keefe is always doing. Everybody wants to talk. Nobody can keep their mouth shut. So I don't see them being able to pull off grand conspiracies, so that's why I stay away from them. But that could be my prejudice. I'm not giving them credit enough for what they could do. But you have to understand the agenda behind gun control. The agenda is nefarious. It's not. It's not. They're not being genuine in what they're saying. There is an agenda there, and it's not to save people's lives. It's about control. It's about consolidating power. It's about control, being able to control us. There's no legitimate reason to take away guns from law-abiding citizens. There's no legitimate reason to even infringe upon it. Now, if I was the governor of Texas, and I like our governor, but he's a follower, he's not a leader. If I was him, I would immediately get the Texas Senate and Congress to pass a law that said that if you are a license to carry in Texas, you're automatically a member of the new Texas militia that we're just forming. Not only are you now a member of this new well-regulated militia, we're also going to send you a gun. We're going to send you a rifle. I don't care if it's fully automatic. Let it be fully. Or semi-automatic rifle, and here's 1,000 rounds of ammo. These are now your responsibility, and should we need you, we'll call you up for defense of Texas. All these states need to take back their ability to defend themselves from the federal government. Things are going to get ugly, I believe. I have the prejudice that it's going to be a slow process, but it could be a lot faster than we want it to be. That would be my plan for Texas, is let's make everybody who has a license to carry, because if you have a license to carry a gun, concealed handgun permit's what it used to be, and now it's just a license to carry, so you don't have to conceal it. That means that you have a little bit of an understanding of the laws and the rules, and you've also went to a mediocre, training where you can show that you can hit a target. Literally, if you had your eyes closed, you could pass this test and hit this target, because it's all very close. But, most of the time, if you're going to use a gun in defense, it's going to be very close, because if they're far away, you had no reason, unless they're shooting at you, you have no reason to shoot them. If somebody's running at me with a bat and he's 100 yards away, I'm not going to be shooting at him. I'm going to be like, hey, back off. I'm going to shoot you. And at 50 yards, I'm still not going to be shooting him. Probably around 20 yards is when I'm going to shoot him. And it's pretty easy to hit something at 20 yards. Maybe at 20 yards, I'm not shooting him. Maybe I wait till 10 yards or even 5 yards. At 5 yards, I can put a lot of rounds into somebody before they get to me. So you don't need to be able to shoot very far to use a gun effectively in self-defense. So I guess I'm being a little negative about the test you have to pass to get a license to carry. I mean, at the last section, the farthest away section, I just played around and still was able to get a perfect score. And I am not a marksman at all. I can do really good with 30-30 at about 100 yards, but other than that, I am not a marksman at all. But there's an agenda behind this, and you got to be aware of it. But Texas needs to step it up, and Florida and the other states need to step it up. I know we're passing laws, though you don't even need a license to carry a gun, but we need to protect us more from the federal government. I think we need to reinstate state militias. We need to automatically make everybody who has some semblance of a training a part of the militia, and then we ought to send them at the state expense, send them a rifle that they're forced to maintain. They're forced to have. Send them 1,000 rounds every year. You want them to practice 1,000 rounds in that rifle every year. Send them 1,000 rounds every year to practice with. Make sure they know how to use it. Make sure that maybe they have to present it every once in a while make sure they're keeping it adequately cleaned or something. But I'm serious. We need that. That would be awesome. I would support that wholeheartedly. But whenever somebody wants to come at you with, gun control stats, it's a natural law. It doesn't matter. Your stat is, first of all, is inaccurate to begin with. I guarantee it. Even the stats I said today are probably inaccurate. The best you can do is just do a little bit of research and try to get them from the sources of the source of the source. Get them straight from FBI or whoever you can, because if it's on a website, it's been manipulated. But there is no argument. It's a natural right. You can't tell me what I can and cannot own. That is a natural right. It is mine. I own it. And you can't prevent that. Not only that, you can't prevent me from my right to life and my right to protect my life. And the easiest way to protect one's life is with a firearm. And it was so important we put it in the Constitution, because we knew. That's why it's there. You know, there was I read a story. I wish I remember what book it was in so I can get it exact names for you. But there was some of the founding fathers, and one of them wrote to the president. It might have been Jefferson. It might have been Washington, and because he needed a cannon to go on his property, he's just having problems with. Like, it wasn't Americans. It must have been pirates or something. And this wasn't a privateer either. It wasn't a ship he was putting. He was putting the cannon on his land. He needed this. Maybe it was Indians. I don't know. And so he wrote the president. And, you know, this guy was one of the founding fathers, so he had access to the president. A lot of people had access to the president back then. But he had access to the president, and he wrote the president, and he said, you know, I'm not sure, can I legally have a cannon? You know, I know it's right to bear arms. Does that mean cannons as well? And the president wrote back and said, get yourself a cannon. We can't tell you what you can and can't own. It's go get your cannon. It's the right to bear arms. They wanted the people to have the same caliber of weapons as militaries. What good is if everybody has a musket when you're fighting against people with M60s? Musket's not going to do anything. So they wanted us to have. That's just a story I read once in a book. I'm sure it was true because I remember. You know what? The guy who wrote it, I think, his name was Tom Woods, and I believe that he is. So it was one of his books. I believe he's pretty careful with the things he says. Anyways, that's what I wanted to talk to you about today. Thank you for tuning in to the Producing Half podcast, the podcast where we talk about, what it means to be a working American, an American who produces, not necessarily a guy out there digging ditches or something. I've did that myself, but just anybody who produces. You could be blue collar, white collar, it doesn't matter. If you're a producer, you know it, and you produce, and this is what this is for. Stay tuned for the next one. I have no idea what it's about, but hopefully I'll do some more research. Talk to you later.